What do you think?
There should be a focused research for the continent. We know what we have. We know what we lack. We should streamline our research activity towards what we lack so that to get what we want. And in doing so, what we need to do is to get incorporated in such a way that each country has its own peculiarity in terms of agricultural development, in terms of other development in scientific area. What we need to do is have a streamlined, defined research where people should go and study. Those that are going to study in the areas of those countries' interests should be streamlined, should have a focus, and when they come back, if they study outside, because there is need for integration outside your knowledge, to go outside the country, within Africa, within Europe, within Asia, within wherever you can go to find the knowledge, to incorporate into your own existing knowledge. So what you need to do is just to get a streamlined research that is in line with your country's demand. And when these conglomerate of people come back, they should have a set of laboratories ready for them, and they should have a defined line of funding ready for them. And with
Good morning, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for taking your time to join us in today's webinar. I'm Canisius Kanangire, the Executive Director of AATF. On behalf of myself and the AATF fraternity, I would like to welcome you all. Let us take a few minutes to share our manifesto.
We believe that the future of Africa lies in its vast land. We believe the future is in the hands of those who walk the fields for a better and more productive Africa. We believe our hands come bearing technologies and solutions that ensure but deliver results that ensure a sustainable, prosperous, and food-secure Africa. At AATF, we are driving transformation of livelihoods in sub-Saharan Africa through innovation. We promise to deliver prosperity
Indeed, it is AATF's promise to facilitate prosperity through technology. Before I introduce our panelists today, let us have a quick review of the issues at hand. Our discussion will focus on global spikes in fertilizer and basic commodity prices, especially the role of global shocks, including the Russia-Ukraine crisis, and lessons for resilience building. Colleagues, According to a new World Bank report, the Ukraine-Russia conflict has led to the largest commodity price shock since the 1973 oil crisis, elevating prices for years to come. Also, according to a 2022 report by the International Food Policy Research Institute, by March 2022, prices of food and fertilizer had risen by 84% and 222% respectively. Further forecasts indicate that fertilizer prices are expected to see the most sustained inflation, with the prices in 2024 remaining 82% above the World Bank's October 2021 forecasts. The crisis worsens pre-existing tensions in global supply chains amid a strained global economy that is only just emerging from the COVID pandemic. Fertilizer producers have been hit hard by the rise in the price of natural gas, which serves as a key input, as well as an export ban by Russia, the world's largest fertilizer exporter. Inflation in fertilizer markets will inevitably feed into consumer food prices because of both high input costs and reduced yields. Ladies and gentlemen, the impact of Russia-Ukraine conflict on food security has been concentrated on countries highly dependent on wheat imports by the Black Sea region, given the importance of wheat products in the diets of people in these countries. In Africa, the crisis has exposed the vulnerability of our food systems. Increasingly, the big question is, how should African countries respond to this crisis? The direct and indirect impact of this crisis on Africa's agriculture deserves a closer look, not only on how it negatively impacts the sector, but also considering emerging opportunities to rethink African agricultural investment going into the future. In today's forum, our panel of experts will help us gain a clear understanding on, firstly, the current trends in the prices of fuel and food commodities and their drivers and linkages with pandemics and the current Ukraine-Russia crisis, as well as the impact on the agricultural sector in the short and long run. Secondly, it will help us understand, they will help us understand some of the strategies undertaken by the global community, including governments, development partners, and private sector to deal with the crisis. And thirdly, they will help us understand the short and long-term measures necessary for building resilience and present possible local solutions to ensuring food security with or without these unexpected shocks. Let me now introduce to you our esteemed panel of experts. We are joined today by Dr. Usman Badian, the founder and the executive chairperson of Academia 2063. He is an agricultural economist with over 3 decades of experience in academia and international development. Usman is also the chairperson of the AATF Board of Trustees. Welcome, Usman. We are also pleased to have architect Kabir Ibrahim, the national president of All Farmers Association of Nigeria. As the president, Kabir coordinates all farmers associations, cooperatives, and other bodies involved in agriculture and agro-allied matters in Nigeria. Welcome, Kabir. And finally,
thank you very much, Doctor.
Yeah, thank you. And finally, we have Dr. Daniel Kyalowili, Program Officer, Policy and Regulatory Affairs at AATF. In this role, Daniel supports policy work to facilitate the creation of an enabling environment for agricultural technology adoption, input and output market access, as well as facilitating efficient value chains. Welcome, Daniel. I want to thank you, gentlemen, for taking time to be part of this very important discussion. And also thank you, our participants, for being with us this afternoon or morning, depending on where you are. Let me take a few minutes to highlight some of the rules of engagement during this webinar. First, we will kick off our discussion today with a presentation from Daniel. And thereafter, we will have an open discussion with Usman and Kabir. Daniel will take 15 minutes, and the two other panelists' discussion will take 30 minutes. After that, we will invite questions from you, the participants, for further discussions. You are all encouraged to post your questions and comments on the chat box, and we will collect them for response by the panelists. We will take a minute to share poll questions on topics and ideas shared by our panelists in a way of participating to the process of this webinar. Now, let me invite Daniel to make his presentation. And Daniel will highlight some suggested short and long-term measures for building resilience and possible local solutions to address the crisis. Over to you, Daniel.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kanangire, for having me in this important conversation. This conversation comes at a time when many countries in Africa and actually globally indeed are facing unprecedented levels of inflation. And therefore, it is critical for us to engage in such discussions, and particularly to understand how this crisis is affecting our people, and more important, to draw some lessons from the crisis that can help us to build the resilience of our food production and consumption systems. So allow me to share my slides on a few thoughts that I put together to guide us in this conversation. As you all know, we are at a time where the world is going through a crisis that has been initiated by the conflict in Russia and Ukraine. And we have observed a number of things, particularly inflation in food products and also in agro inputs. And therefore, I'm going to just draw some key learnings that we can get from this current happenings. So my presentation will start by giving some sort of background and context. Then I will share with you some lessons that we have learned from this conflict. And then I'll draw some important and critical implications that can help us in the thinking around how can we build resilient food production systems in Africa particularly that can enable us to deal with such crises in the event that they occur. And then I will give some sort of conclusions. So as a starting point, if you crisscross our great continent that we call home, Africa, you will find so many delicious diets spanning from jollof rice in West Africa, coming to gali in East Africa, and all the way to Seswa in Botswana. Not forgetting awashi in Egypt. But what we note in most of these diets is that there are just a few critical ingredients that we depend on to prepare these foods. You'll find the four most common ingredients would be wheat flour, maize flour, rice, obviously cooking oil. And of course, there will be some diets that are based on cassava, yam, banana, and plantain, different types of meat, and also beans and cowpea. But then the critical question we need to ask ourselves is, where do we get this food from? And I've just taken an example of wheat, and you can see from the graph presented on my left here that the wheat that we consume in Africa, part of it, of course, is from our own production. And as you can see, the bulk of it is imported. And this example can cut across all the other commodities, rice, maize, and many others. And as you can see from the graph on my right here, you can see that Africa spends actually up to $40 billion annually to import food. And you can see the gap between the food imports and food exports is so wide. So this clearly shows that we are a net importer of food. Now, as we think of this issue of that the bulk of our food comes actually from outside the continent, we need to again put a sharp focus on the role that Russia and Ukraine plays in the international food markets. And I've split this into two. There's the agro input supply aspect and also the food supply aspect. Focusing on the agro input supply aspect, we note that Russia and Ukraine contribute a lot to the energy sector. We know that 10% of the global petroleum exports come from Russia. And also the 40% of natural gas that goes to EU states comes from Russia as well. And we know also Ukraine is an important transit route for petroleum and natural gas exports from Russia. Focusing on fertilizers, we also know that Russia and Ukraine play a very critical role in the export of fertilizers and also the materials that we need for the production of fertilizer. In terms of food supply, 14% of the global supply of maize comes from Russia and Ukraine. Also 28% of global wheat supply, not forgetting 58%, which is quite substantial, of the global supply of sunflower oil that is used as an edible oil. And therefore, the question is, how is Africa dependent on these two countries for their food supply? And it is a fact that about 85% of the imports of basic food to Africa definitely comes from outside the region. And just to draw an example, you can see out of the several sources from where Africa can draw its wheat imports, Russia is number 1, Ukraine is number 3, and the other countries follow there. So this, of course, puts a sharp focus on how dependent our continent is on Russia and Ukraine for the food products. Because some people have been asking me this question, if there is an issue in these two countries, why can't we get the products from other countries? But you can see, obviously, there's a very high dependence on these two countries for particular food products, maize, wheat, for example, and as I indicated, cooking oil. And therefore, the effects of what is happening in Russia and Ukraine has been an increase in the prices of several commodities, whether you are in Chile, in Kenya, Chinoy in Zimbabwe, St. Louis in Senegal, or Accra in Ghana. What we are observing are that generally there's a very high level of inflation. And as you can see from the graph in the middle, around February, when this crisis started, you can see the FAO Food Commodity Price Index for vegetable oils, cereals, shot up. You can see most of the commodities that are sourced from within, like meat and sugar, the index has been a bit flat, but you can see for vegetable oils and cereals, there is a sharp increase starting from February. And that, of course, points to the effect of the conflict in Russia and Ukraine on the prices of these basic commodities. And I've just picked an example of Kenya here, where I am. And you can see between January 2021 and January 2022, there has been a consistent increase in the price of commodities. And more critical to note is that if you look at the prices today, I just checked today in our supermarkets, you can see maize flour is the price is 70% more than it was in January 2021. The same story is replicated in wheat flour as well as cooking oil. And I'm sure those of us following up from different parts of this continent, you can agree with me that this effect is being felt all over the place. And the inflation is not just in food commodities, it is also in the it is also in the oil and gas prices, because what we have seen, and I presented some petrol prices in June, just this month, across the continent. And as you can see, the prices are quite higher than what they were previously. And looking at the press, you can see, obviously, there are a lot of reportings around the increase in the price of fuel. I just looked at the Independent from Uganda, and they are saying the prices have increased 54% by the end of May. You can, looking at the Business Daily, here in Kenya, you can see that the prices increased by almost 50% again, 47%, and this is replicated all over the place. Again, focusing on the price of fertilizers, we can see that all over the continent, there is a sharp increase in the price of fertilizers, and farmers indeed are suffering as a result of this. And just to quote an article that was published by the president of IFPRI in the East African just recently, fertilizer prices, particularly DAP, are surging towards the $1,000 per ton, with a significant increase in the last 6 months, and a 4% jump since the invasion in Russia and Ukraine. And of course, this will hurt the farmers. Now, just want to share with you some brief explanation, trying to link the inflation with the crisis. And this comes through three pathways. The first one is the blockades that have been happening since the invasion, destruction of the productive capacity, and there is an impact of the invasion on trade and production as a result of sanctions. So without going to very detailed economic principles, I want to use the simple concept of demand and supply. As you can see, the blue line represents the demand of a commodity, let's say maize. The red one is the supply of the same commodity. And where those two lines meet, this is the market clearing equilibrium. And farmers would be buying, consumers would be buying, let's say 100 tons of maize at $600, for example. But as a result of the invasion, then there is reduced supply in the global markets. And as you can see, this has edged the red line inwards. implying that now the available maize in the market is much lower than it was before. And as a result of that, then the equilibrium has moved, and then the price is much higher. And we have to note that the inflation we are observing is not solely as a result of the Russia-Ukraine invasion. You will recall that this invasion came at a time when the world was facing COVID-19 crisis. And as a result of the crisis, we had a lot of restricted movement of goods and people. Some economies went into some recess. That, of course, affected foreign exchange availability. We have issues of currency devaluation across the continent. And of course, this raises the cost of imports, making imported goods more expensive. And I hope you recall from the beginning, I said, we import the bulk of what we eat. And therefore, definitely, if our currencies are devalued, then we are likely to have, more expensive foodstuffs that are again fueling inflation. Drought, of course, is something that we all know reduces the supply of foods and commodities. And therefore, in a nutshell, this is what we can use to explain the inflation. So moving quickly to my next stage, what lessons do we draw from this crisis? Lesson number one, what we have seen is that our food basket is composed of a very, the highest percentage of our food basket that drives our food security is composed of very few commodities. For example,
3 minutes remaining, Daniel.
All right, let me rush through this. So, for example, we know maize and wheat and rice form a very big component of our diets. And of course, we have to rethink of how should we re-engineer our production, processing, distribution, and consumption processes. The second lesson is that our food basket, again, is dependent on very few countries. And as you can see from the graph here, you see a country like Benin depends entirely, 100% of its imports come from one country. And you can see 25 countries in here have also more than 50% of their wheat imports coming from just 2 countries. And therefore, that raises the issue of vulnerability in case there is any man-made crisis such as the one we are facing. Of course, we are also facing food governance issues. Our strategic food reserves are not in a very good position because, as you can see, only a month after the invasion, most countries were really suffering because there was not enough food. That shows that our reserves cannot hold enough, or rather not holding enough food to sustain us for quite some time. There's also the critical importance of green economy, which has come into sharp focus. As I conclude, we ask ourselves, therefore, what actions can we take beyond the lessons that we are learning to enhance our resilience? One critical lesson is that as we look across Africa, Africa is endowed with a very rich agroecological diversity. We have several areas where we should be able to produce different commodities, whether in the Sahel, the Guinea Savannah, or across humid and semi-humid zones in Africa. And therefore, what we need to do is to maximize the production in these agroecological areas so that we can be able to produce enough. And just to note a few initiatives that are going on, AATF, the organization I work for, is dedicated to bring technologies that can be able to help farmers to produce more in their arable lands. We have the Feed Africa initiative. We know the president of the African Development Bank, when he took office, he had 5 priorities. One of them was Feed Africa. And he is doing very well in this. And the Technologies for African Agricultural Transformation is one of the projects that is helping in this. And of course, the bank also recently set up an African emergency food production facility, which African countries can tap into to help them to deal with the effects of the crisis. The other priority area we need to think through is, yes, we know that Africa has huge lands, arable lands, but which we have not put into production. But the more critical is, even the land that we've put into production, we know that our total factor productivity is very low. And therefore, we need to think through how can we do that? And by just enhancing the total factor productivity in the land we are farming already, we can increase the amount of food we are producing to the level that we should even be able to feed the world. We know that most of the breakfast tables in Africa, you find bread in the morning. But the bread, if you do a sample, most of this bread is just based on wheat. The question is, why don't we diversify into producing commodities, processing, and also consumption that are made from locally available foodstuffs? For example, we have bread from cassava, bread from sorghum, and I'm glad to say that Egerton University has initiated the deployment of a variety, EUS 130, a cultivar that is ideal for baking. And these few examples show us that indeed we can maximize on the use of the foodstuffs that we have in the continent, blending with a little from the imports, and that can help us to be more sufficient. And of course, trade is very important. As we increase production, in our countries, we also need to think through how do we engage in trade reforms that can help us to ensure that the food that is produced maybe in Egypt can move all the way to Cape Town, Zimbabwe, seamlessly. And this needs maybe some few reforms in trade to help to eliminate tariff and non-tariff barriers in the continent. And of course, my opinion is that if we actualize the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, this would be a very important way. And of course, infrastructure is very critical. We must connect Africa in a better way that commodities will move at low cost from one end of Africa to the other end. Finally, as I conclude, we have definitely noted that the Russia-Ukraine crisis has exposed our vulnerability, the vulnerability of our food systems. And we need to reduce our overdependence on a few countries for strategic food commodities. And this can come through diversifying the content of our food basket with the inclusion of locally produced food commodities, tapping into our rich diversity of our agroecologicals, and of course, providing incentives to our farmers, our processors, our consumers towards the blending and consumption of locally produced agricultural commodities, and of course, boosting intra-Africa trade through actualization of the AFCTA and all the allied trade reforms. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your time. Those are the thoughts that I had around this topic, and I will be on standby in case of any questions. Thank you very much. Back to you, Dr. Canisius Kanangira. Dr. Kanagire? Yeah, as we wait for Dr. Kanagire to rejoin, I think we have gone through this. We have seen what the crisis has brought here. And we know that, yes, this is a crisis, but indeed, there are lessons that we can draw. And these lessons can help us to build the resilience of our production systems across the continent. And therefore, this calls for action from all of us. Over to you, Canisius.
We believe that the future of Africa lies in its vast land. We believe the future is in the hands of those who walk the fields. For those are the hands that feed nations and ensure a better and more productive Africa. We believe that the future of Africa lies in its vast land. We believe the future is in the hands of those who walk the fields. For those are the hands that feed nations and ensure a better and more productive Africa.
Thank you very much, Daniel. I'm very sorry I have been disconnected. There has been a problem on my connection. Yeah, from the presentation, we can see that there is a huge dependence on Russia and Ukraine for key commodities that we need here in Africa, and that is, of course, quite a problem. The second is that the oil and gas products, which are also coming from that region, are key input to fertilizer producers. And of course, it becomes also another issue as well as on the transportation sector, because our food need to be transported. So it comes also as a factor to increase the prices of those commodities. Another thing I took from Daniel's presentation is the need to re-engineer our production system so that we can reduce the vulnerability of African continent to this importation of key commodities. And also, I think your presentation was a call for action so that we can take the right decision and re-engineer our system so that we can reduce our vulnerability to shocks. Let me now invite Dr. Usman Badian and architect Kabir Ibrahim to the panel discussion. Let me start with Usman. Could you please help us with painting a picture of how the commodity price crisis directly or indirectly affect African food systems, especially linking this to the UN food system and the findings we got from that process on the African food systems? Please, can you pen this for us? How bad is it?
Thank you very much, Canisius, and good day to everybody around here. Let me start with a comment that I like to make every time I see the statistics about African food imports and how high it is. If you were to go back to the slide of, I'm not asking you to show the slide, but if you were to look at the slide that Daniel showed, looking at the trajectory of exports, the first half of the 90s, African food imports have been basically flat. They haven't changed much. I'm not asking that to show it, it may distract people, but if you want to do, you can do that. So if you remember that slide, the first half of the 90s, the imports levels were flat. They started increasing as African economies started recovering. And I'm saying this because it is the faster economic growth in Africa that is driving the imports. It is not a sluggish or stagnating agricultural sector that is the source or the reason of these large import bills. As economies grow, population grow, coming from 2 decades of stagnation, there's an explosion of demand. Demand is growing perhaps by a double-digit rate. Agriculture cannot grow by that much in a sustained way. So that's why you have this gap. So what's good about that, though, is that we have this market ahead of us. agriculture in Africa has had the fastest growing productivity over the last 2 decades, faster than any other region of the world. Yes, from low levels, but we're also at low levels when we're declining. So the idea is that to understand that there's a market ahead of us. The import surge has helped us feed our people and avoid hunger. Fewer people are going to bed hungry, and we have a market ahead of us. Now, coming to the crisis, let me focus first on the fertilizer one, perhaps, and then I'm going to talk about the others. What happened to the fertilizer markets is that the projections before the crisis were seeing prices coming down from their high levels after COVID to start declining. The only exception then was potassium, that was still seen to be increasing. Every other fertilizer price was declining. It is completely the opposite since the war. Prices are now climbing from at least 40% higher than they've been before the crisis. And for urea and potassium, they are almost doubling, 80 to 120%. So it's a huge change, but what's important is that for 2023 and 2024, they will hardly reduce. That means that these high prices are going to be with us over the next couple of years. Daniel talked about how these higher fertilizer prices affect agriculture. Our numbers, which we'll be publishing in the coming days or weeks, show that fertilizer use has gone down by between 20 and 30% in the countries that we've looked at. And those are about 10 countries that are the most exposed to this crisis. So, of course, the impact is going to be different in those countries, depending on which sector you're talking about, because not all sectors use heavily fertilizers, just like not all countries use heavily fertilizers. But the reduction is about 20 to 30% in terms of fertilizer use. And the impact on crop output is anywhere between 3 to 10%, just right now in 2022. Now, if this continues in the coming years, of course, you expect that to continue every other year. So if you got a country that is losing 10% cross output because of fertilizer over 3 years, it's a huge, huge shock to the country. And that affects the entire GDP of these countries as well, to the tune of some 0.15 to some others 2-3% GDP knockoff from the fertilizer alone, which is a huge thing. Now, maybe you want me to stop here and then come back to the channels. If you give me 1 minute, I'll just talk about the channels. The biggest impacts here is not just fertilizers. We were looking at fertilizers because of what it represents for food security. But we looked at 46 commodities that are being tracked by the World Bank in terms of price projections. And we looked at how those 46 commodities are changing, or their markets are being disrupted, and what that means. Because countries do not only buy from the global markets, they also sell. So in other words, how much you're getting for what you're selling now compared to before the war, and how much you're paying for what you're buying now is the biggest shock to the economy as a whole. In other words, the impact on your trade balance or your terms of trade. And if you look at that, it can be quite sizable across African countries. Unlike COVID, we've seen that most African countries are losing in terms of trade than they did under COVID. In other words, the prices of the commodities they export have risen less than the prices of the commodities that they import. And that's impacted growth in the 10 countries we're looking at. It's impacted employment in the 10 countries we're looking at. It's affected incomes across households, and has also affected poverty and food consumption. So the last channel is wheat itself as a product, and you'll talk about it. Wheat price increases have two effects on these economies. The first is as people spend more on wheat, they have less to spend on other foods. It's just almost like a tax on their income. The second effect is that it contributes to raising food price inflation and therefore affecting everybody else in the economies. There you have looked at the impact of wheat price surge and disruptions and what it meant for African economies in terms of food price inflation, in terms of consumption change and food security across rural and urban and within rural farm and farm household. And those results are going to be up on our website. Look for it over the next couple of weeks. Thank you very much. We don't hear you, Canisius, you're muted.
Okay, thank you very much, Usman. I think it is a combination of so many factors which lead to the current situation. So even before the crisis, we had some issues with the stagnation of investment in agriculture. I think that is something we need to address. The good news is that, as Usman says, agriculture is growing very quickly. But the spike of fertilizer on the international market, I think, is a key problem, because it leads to reducing also the yield. So it has an impact in the near and probably on long-term future. So let me come back to this, but asking, obviously currently we very much depend on supply of fertilizer from these countries, Russia and Ukraine. But does Africa has the potential to create its own mechanism of producing fertilizers to support agriculture and cushion a bit the shock that we would have from these disturbance we get from different conflict or issues in that part of the world? I mean, here, Russia, Ukraine, and other countries in that region. Does Africa has the potential and the mechanism, and do we even prioritize our own production of fertilizers so that we can cushion ourselves against those changes? Usman, can you still help us with that?
Okay, so the fertilizer sector, of course, is, as you know, kind of concentrated across Africa. The fertilizer sector and the production is somewhat concentrated in terms of its production structure. You have big players like Morocco, Nigeria is surging now. You have some phosphate in Senegal and so on. It is highly linked to the oil industry as well. So the challenge for the fertilizer industry in Africa, and I'm not an expert in that, seems to do a lot with the structure of demand. In most countries outside of industrial crops and fruits and vegetables, in most, demand is kind of low because of the purchasing power of farmers, but also, as you know better than me, the seeds that go with it, the package, the practices. Farmers wouldn't buy fertilizer if the rest of that is there. So it's really a chicken and egg issue. Heavy investment is required into fertilizer. Demand structure doesn't encourage an increase of fertilizer demand. Countries have tried with fertilizer subsidies, which helped Malawi, for example, get quite high level of fertilizer use in the maize sector. It did have, however, quite a large fiscal tab to go with it. So I think it will take concerted effort, governments and private sector, to come together to bring the necessary ingredients for a well-functioning fertilizer sector, so that you have the incentive to invest, but also the markets to pay for the fertilizer, the distribution networks, and the like. The hopeful note here is that the fruit and vegetable sector in most countries is getting by without subsidies and is capable of procuring and applying higher levels of imports, which needed to intensify. So if we create similar conditions for our staples, I think it will create the markets and investment will follow. But it's going to be hard to get investment without the markets being in place. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Usman. Kabir, what do you think is the short and long-term impact that the current trends would have on farmers in the African continent, and especially on smallholder farmers?
Well, it's going to be very catastrophic if the prices of especially fertilizer continue to rise, because most of our farmers, smallholder farmers, cannot afford it. So right now, inflation, food inflation is all over Africa and is in fact global. If this thing continues, that if these crises continue, the thing will be exacerbated. So we will be very, very vulnerable. We are already vulnerable, we'll be more vulnerable. So we need to do a few things in Africa. Like the presentation showed, we must show a lot of presence in production of our own fertilizers and other inputs. Because if we import them and we use dollar to import them, inflation will still be very high because some of our currencies have very low purchasing power. Finally, and definitely, the situation in Africa will be very bad, but there are certain measures in place now that will open Africa so that we all work together. You see, a certain experience that we have had recently has shown that every country of the world is really on its own. Even where you rely on importing things from abroad, you are not able to do that. If you take the period 2020 and part of 2021, when COVID was at its highest, we could not import anything from anywhere. So every country was left to fend for itself. But if we really walk our talk in Africa through the AFCFTA, that is AFTA, we make Africa a common market and a free market for everybody, just like the EU, we might be able to really mitigate the effect. But other than that, it will be very, very difficult because as this crisis in Ukraine and Russia continues, for instance, most of these things will be hard to come by. I remember recently in Nigeria, about 4 months ago, we said we could import some of the components of fertilizer making because we have so many blending plants in Nigeria from Russia. I understand that a bit of it is on the high seas now, but the prices are very high. All our blenders are getting that, and the fertilizer prices are very high, more than quadrupled from what we had in 2020 and 2021. So if the crisis continues, for instance, and we're not able to even import anything from any of these countries, the thing will be very catastrophic. Before we change to other countries and all that, within Africa, we must emulate countries like Morocco and others that have looked inwards and are producing some of the components of this. And in so much quantities that we should be able to export these things ourselves. Because you see, in Africa, we have a lot of potential, but we have not exploited them. What is underground is many, many times more than what is in the other countries that are adding value. But we have failed to add value to anything that we have. And this is the bane of our problems in Africa. I encourage Africa to unite. All the African countries should unite. Where Africa, we should be the United States of Africa, just like the United States in all facets, in all ramifications. To Nairobi, it's like I'm coming to a very, very different country in Africa that does not accommodate me, does not look at my idiosyncrasies and all that as a Nigerian. We should all be familiar with what in every, and all our food, the staples that are staples in other countries should be able to really feed us, either directly or indirectly. And then, as he said in the presentation, we must have seamless connection. With in communicating with people and moving around should also be enhanced. That way, our food systems will work together. Those that are very weak will be leveraged by others that are very strong. And together we will all be prosperous in Africa. Otherwise, you know, I don't see I see a very bleak future for Africa in the long run. Even now, in the short term, we are already in trouble. If these things continue, we will be in more trouble.
Yeah, we are in trouble, and we may be further in that trouble if things continue the same way. And you have painted very vividly the picture of the current situation with the issues that Africa is facing today. And you also highlighted the potential that we have and the need for Africa to unite so that we can harness the complementarity between different regions. But Kabir, I will come back to you with another question. Those are the issues, and we know we have the potentials, and that needs to unlock those potential. We need a high political will, a high level of leadership to put all those processes in motion and be able to produce some of the key products that we need, including fertilizers, for example. Tell me, do you have some cases where some African countries have put in place are in better position to face similar shocks that we are having today? Do we have some level of step forward in making sure that lessons learned from the pandemic first and from this current crisis are at least unlocking some of the strength and determination of some of African countries to move in the right direction?
Well, there are so many, but it's a mixed bag. You see, when we have overdependence on government and the private sector does not involve itself squarely in some of these things, there are gaps. But in Nigeria, for instance, we have the Dangote refinery with byproducts that it can produce urea to complement what other companies have been doing over the years. Now, the total installed factories is about 6 million metric tons of urea. That is in excess of what we need in Nigeria. Now they export to other countries. If they strictly export to countries in Africa that have need, you can see the effort is now going to permeate the system, is going to make it a lot easier. Now the concept of development also must be looked upon as you must work on the energy sector in Africa as a whole. If you don't have sufficient energy to add value to some of these things, be able to really help yourself or help others. Nigeria has always claimed to be the giant of Africa, but it should be a giant of Africa in its full ramifications, not just by name. We must be able to be the hub of so many of these things that we claim to do by making institutions work. Same thing in Kenya, same thing in other countries. We must be able to harness those things that we have comparative advantage in, and leadership in all cases must be on merit. People should be put in place who can do the job. You know, we should not be ancient in paying people to vote for us or things like that, to get leaders or rulers that we don't need, who cannot even do anything, who cannot, who don't have ideas and all that. We must be able to look at all these things and make sure that we approximate to what is best for the world. Take, for instance, it is only in Africa that you have 80-year-olds and all that, that are leaders. In the United States, we had an African American who became a president at less than 50. We can see what he did for him, and even some people at 60 are said to be too young to rule.
Yeah, thank you.
So the leadership system is very, very important in Africa.
Thank you very much, Kabir. Usman, let me come back to you. What would be the key lessons that emerge from this situation that Africa should take in order to cushion all this? What will be the key lesson? And I will also take one of the questions from the participants. What those lessons should be taken on board to revolutionize our agriculture, but how? What would be the key access for that revolutionization? I will call it transformation of agriculture.
Thank you very much. This is one of those big events that are hard to plan for. When they happen, they tend to shock the real economy. Shocks that tend to be very difficult to absorb. They happen. It's not just in African countries, but across the globe because of just their size. That being said, the exposure to these shocks is something that needs to be understood and to be managed. And the ramifications throughout the economy need to be understood. We are putting a lot of emphasis here on being dependent on the global markets. You know, if it's not for imports, it's going to be for exports. So the global markets, whatever happens, is going to affect us. So therefore, how we developed the capacity to absorb these shocks when they come, that's what's important. Let's say you were to boost African production today of agriculture, a lot of it's going to be exported as well. So if you have shocks like this, it could be the opposite of that. The global markets like under COVID close down, then you also have a lot of imports. So when these shocks come, what do you do as an economy? Okay, so do you have social safety nets? Do you have the financial reserves? Do you have the institutional infrastructure so that you can act against these shocks and minimize the impact on your economy? That's what's really important to do. Obviously, you ought to have a prudent, just starting from the top, macroeconomic policy, that it don't start with you being on a high level of debt and then having to have to either borrow more money internally or externally to face them. You have to have a better understanding of the patterns and the nature of vulnerability across your communities, so you can shore up livelihoods where it is necessary. You need to have the institutional framework, including the technical expertise that allows you to anticipate and analyze how these shocks are going to be reverberating through your economy. So you know where the pressure points would be. You can then bring on board the kind of solutions that you need. So it is not one thing that you do, it is your readiness and your capacity to do several things when these shocks happen. That's the most important. It could be very easy for us to say, let's just double or triple agriculture production. That still will not shore us up, protect us against high prices, because when they affect the global markets, they will affect us, they're going to be transmitted. Even those products that are not being sold on the global market today, your maize, your cassavas, I'm talking about white maize, your cowpeas and others are already being affected by the crisis, but they're not being sold or bought on the global market. So it is really our capacity to understand crises and shocks, to plan ahead and to deal with them.
With connections.
I've been, were you having problems? Can you hear me, or was it?
Yeah, we could not hear you, but now it is good.
Oh, okay. Sorry. I don't know where, but let me just sum up because I don't want to be too long. I was just saying that it is not one thing that you do. It is your capacity to do several things that may be needed when you have these shocks. to respond to that. Even if we were to double or triple agricultural production today, the shocks in the global markets will be transmitted to our local markets. We have commodities we don't sell or buy in the world markets. Your cowpeas, your fonio, your white maize, your cassava, they're being affected. So it is really the capacity to deal with shock and not a production issue or a trade issue. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Usman. Let me come back to Kabir. We are saying, we are speaking to the impact this will have on the farmers' activity and productivity and production of food in general. And we know that African farmers were already burdened and struggling with crises such as climate change and even before this conflict. What is your take on the long-term outlook for the continent in as far as agriculture is concerned? Where are we heading?
Well, we have a mixture of many things unless we act very well. You see, if you depend so much on importation of many things, including even the components with which you produce, you are at the mercy of the people from whom you do that. And if there's a global crisis, you know it will have no borders. It will affect everybody. So I still go back to Africa because you know we are endowed. We have very large arable land. It is irrigable and cultivable to add value, to process, and then to create the right kind of market. Because if people produce and they don't get good value to sell and do other things, the economy will still be very bad. It's a vicious cycle. You know, the food system may look very good, and people might get prosperity only if others, the people who consume, are able to buy and sustainably too. So the thing is, we are caught between the devil and the deep blue sea in terms of productivity and distribution and consumption and all that. The food system essentially means production, processing, distribution, and even consumption. So in Africa, so that we will be self-sufficient or almost self-sufficient, I understand that we need to do trade with other parts of the globe. But in Africa, we must do trade that will help us all. We must be able to create a good market for everything that our farmers, we must use good science and technology. We must use mechanization. We must also be mindful of climate change. And then we must recognize that we have a lot of our land that is not being cultivated. We must expand it, and then we will get the best out of it. And then our population, we have young people, or very young people, the population to get into production in agriculture so that they don't look down upon it. We must do all those things that will make it very attractive to them. And that is why the governments in Africa must be inward looking. They must not only go around to the first world and come back and then get jets and get big cars and get whatever, but they must work within Africa and make the African, capable of producing everything that he or she needs. Africa must be on its own to be able to survive the onslaught of all these things that are coming. There are many, many things that we can do. I'm amazed with the possibilities in GM, for instance. The people doing the investigations and all that are telling us that there is no connection between any GM and any disease. So if our people are made to embrace biotechnology, we will be able to produce more. And then if we add value, even the cassava, the beans, the whatever that are not sold on the global market, they will now be sold in the global market. And we will be able to attract FDIs and foreign exchange into Africa. And Africa will be ultimately prosperous. Wherever we find minerals underground, they should just be a bonus. But agriculture should be the mainstay of Africa's economy, because we have very large expanse of cultivable land. In fact, when I attended the Global Food Security Conference in 2017 in Cornell, everybody was looking towards Africa
Kabir,
for food, because it's only in Africa that you have
Kabir is
large
frozen
expanse of land.
And
can you hear me now?
Okay, you are back.
You see, the whole world, Africa, for food security, because we have a young population, we have a large expanse of cultivable land. All we need to do is to harness it, to make our people incentivized enough to put all their time in agriculture. And then we must be able to add value to what we produce so that we will play on the market, on the global market. The AFTA is a very good step in the right direction. Once we harness it, we'll be able to have enough in Africa. And then if there's anything like extra, we will now start exporting it to other parts of the world. And we will attract foreign direct investment and even foreign exchange, direct foreign exchange into our country. I mean, into our continent.
That is great. I think there is a number of actions that Kabir has presented to us. We have the potential, we have land, we have people, but we need to invest in their exploitation and use technologies, including biotechnology, so that we can increase productivity and reduce those dependence to other factors which hamper the productivity on the African level. I think this is echoed by some of the comments that we have received from the panel. And one of them is that we need to rethink, we need to revolutionize the African continent so that we can realize its full potential. This resonates with what you were just saying. And thank you, Pauline Irungu, for that. And the effect of the spike in global prices for fertilizer on agricultural production has provided an opportunity for some countries to realize that we need to invest in production of fertilizers locally, and it's time for us to see the gap and do something about it. And I'm glad to hear that in Nigeria, from the refinery, Dangote's refinery, we can produce urea, but we need to do more and move towards production of the fertilizers that Africa need. From Jeffrey Wanjala, he pointed out that indeed we have a huge deposits of phosphorus in Morocco, but we need to create that complementarity between African countries and work as one continent to unlock those potential and use that. We want to understand the dynamic and real effect and appreciate the necessary intervention. I think, Masagazi, you are served from the interventions of Dr. Usman Badian, engineer architect Kabir Ibrahim, and the presentation from Daniel Kialo. From Jacob Otieno, the transport sector has been greatly affected by the progressive increase in basic commodity, and asset financial sector has been negatively impacted by this hyperinflation. I think this is what our presenters have gone through and concluded by the need to have a plan, an action plan, which will shield our population against those types of crises. So I want to conclude with a comment from Laina and Leila. Africa has great potential in being the breadbasket of the world due to the vast natural resources and mineral wealth. I believe it's high time Africa rises up and grabs the opportunity of providing a better livelihood for Africa and the world at large through maximum utilization of the natural resources and growing industrialization. I think those are the key input from the participants. Let me now take a chance to ask for our panelists just 1 minute to give us your key last message. Let me start with Usman, then Kabir, and conclude with Daniel. What is your key takeaway?
Thank you, Canisius. First, hopefully this is going to end soon, but even if it did, our work shows that the implications and ramifications will be with us for a couple more years. The work we've done up to 2024 does not show any market recovery from the shocks over the next 3 years. So what it means is we better look at what we did under COVID to provide social safety nets, to allow the economies to reboot and to deal with inflation, the impact on growth and employment and the like. So it is a heavy blow and it's going to be here. The effects are going to be felt for the next few years to come. Another lesson is let's be prepared to have what it takes in terms of institutional infrastructure, a good understanding of the nature and the patterns of vulnerability of our economies, not just our communities, so we're better prepared. Whether it's a war or it is climate change or something else, the future is going to be filled with a lot of shocks, hopefully not like this one, but the shocks are going to be much more frequent. Everybody's warning us for that. So preparedness and capacity to respond is going to be extremely important. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Architect Kabir, your key takeaway?
As agriculture is concerned in Africa, the thing that we need to do is beyond production. We must process properly. We must store properly. We must distribute properly. General value addition is very, very important for what we produce because, as everybody knows, Africa is the food basket of the world only because there is expansive land and there are young people and people do not fear labor. And we innovate, we will do more. The West will now depend on us. What it is that, and it is very funny, most of the things that we import are actually taken raw from Africa and sent back to us. What we must do is that we must be able to appropriately process what we produce such that we can export things not in their primary form too. That's why we are poor. We must be able to add one foreign exchange and Africa will become better. Our health system will become better, which will make our farmers healthier. When we mechanize, we will replace human power with machine power. So we will do more. Our power sector needs to be good in Africa, and we must have a very good health system in Africa. Instead of going for medical tourism in the West, we can go for medical tourism here within Africa. If you look at what happened during the COVID-19 at the heat of it all, nobody can travel anywhere. So in Nigeria, I thought, and I reported and I wrote that we should have health cities in all the 6 geopolitical zones that we had in Nigeria. Every zone should have such a facility so that people will just go there and get the best out of it. But we didn't have anything. People were just dying and all that. We should just be thankful to God that the severity of it, like the experience in Europe, did not happen here in Africa. Otherwise, it would have been disastrous for us. The whole population could have been wiped out. So Africa should really work very hard, and we have to put people who can produce with a lot of integrity, competence, and hard work. That should be the main thing. All appointments, for whatever, either political or anything, should be on merit. People should be put where they can really do and deliver the best that they can. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you. Thank you very much. 1 minute to Daniel.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kanangire. Let me start by appreciating the comment from Francis Gankui, and this is some of the elements are critical. I want to conclude by saying this. This crisis, this conflict is just one among many crises that the world has been facing and will face. And therefore, for us, and the most critical issue here is how do we prepare? Because the question is whether a crisis will come. It is if and when. And therefore, it is not desirable that as a continent, some countries cannot survive even for a month without imports. Some households cannot survive maybe for a month in the event of a tragic event. And therefore, moving forward, we need to rethink seriously how to re-engineer our production and processing capacity. We have to rethink of how do we use more productivity-enhancing technologies. How do we even make our trade balances better? As Dr. Osman Badiane mentioned, I think what we need to say is that we need trade. Trade is good, but we need to be at a better position as a continent that in the event of such catastrophes, we are still at a good position to provide our households with the resources they need to be able to cope with some of these catastrophes. And therefore, what do we need to do? The enabling environment is very critical. On paper, there are so many very good strategies. We have the Cardiff aspirations, we have the Malabo goals. We need to just walk the talk. Let us have the right enabling environment, the right policies that will be help us to become better prepared for these catastrophes. Let us invest in infrastructure that will enable us to enhance our productive and processing capacity. And most important, let us ensure that we make our markets work through policy. Let us make sure that we facilitate the movement of goods across the continent. Thank you very much. And I'm glad to be part of this critical conversation.
There is a challenge on connection. David, Daniel, we could not, yeah. You are done?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, in the parting shot, let us create the enabling environment that will help our people to better prepare for catastrophes when they occur. Thank you.
That is very good, and it links me to some additional comments and questions that I have just received from the chat box. Here there is a comment which connects with the environment, enabling environment you were talking about. From the comment is from Francis, and he says, Africa and its leaders are not ready to weave itself from the Western world. We have been talking over and over, but the political will, the enabling environment for us to manufacture our own fertilizers is not there and won't see light of day if our leaders don't change. And he went on and asked, what happens if this war should continue for years? Can somebody say a few words about that? Another question, let me give the three questions directly and one you will share them. Given, and this is from Lucy Ngari, and it is to Daniel. Given the current food crisis, how do we establish a balance between over-dependence on imports and the concept of comparative advantage stroke disadvantage? And lastly, from somebody who did not give the name, what is keeping the agriculture and feed industry from a wider adoption of microbes? So probably Daniel, since you have you are on the mic, you answer your question on given the current food crisis, how do we establish a balance between overdependence and imports?
Yeah, thank you very much, Lucy, for that question. I think it's a critical balance that we need to strike. On one hand, we are saying, yes, we can focus on the goods that we have competitive and comparative advantage on.
Can you remove the video? Probably it will improve a bit the reception. Try again, please.
Better?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah, so I was saying that it's a good question from Lucy Ngari. And just in my presentation, you noted that there was a very recent study by Virginia Tech.
Oh,
and
we lose you.
Oh.
Huh? We cannot get you, Daniel.
All right.
Maybe it may be that side.
Yeah?
Can the other people hear me?
Yeah, we can hear him, Edie.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, then let him continue then.
Yeah, so to the question from Lucy, I think it's a critical balance that we need to strike. And from my presentation, you noted that a lot of our countries have very low total factor productivity. What that means is even for the goods that we have a competitive advantage over, we are not producing up to our potential. And therefore, yes, I agree with the fact that we need to focus on goods that we have competitive and comparative advantage, but we are still below the par. And what we are saying is, let us have the right technologies, let us have the right environment that can enable us to increase our productive capacity and reach our potential. And actually, by so doing, we'll even be able to produce a surplus that we can trade with the rest of the world. And that by so doing will also improve not just our food self-sufficiency, but also our trade balances. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Usman, would you help with this question from Francis? What would happen if the war should continue for years?
Let's pray it doesn't, because it's going to be bad for everybody, not just for African countries, but the global economy cannot sustain these disruptions. All major wars have led to catastrophic economic outcomes. We don't want to have that. But the issue of weeding off of the global system or the Western countries, I think we can't. The world is going to be interdependent and more globalized. The question is, how do we, in that world, make sure that we fight for our interest, that we can prevail, and that we can't advance like anybody else. And I agree it has to do with leadership and how we manage our economies. If our political and economic governance doesn't allow excellence in what we do, prudence in managing our resources, if our economic and political governance weaken our private sector and then allow investment to return profits and go to the best sectors where we can prevail in the global markets, if a political economic governance doesn't allow the farming sector to thrive, creating the R&D system and the technologies that are needed, if a political and economic governance weaken our exporters in the global markets, then we're not going to be able to get anything from the global system. And cutting ourselves off of it is just going to make matters worse. You look at countries that grow fast, resolve those issues that we're talking about, they're more and more interwoven with the global system. So it is not, there's no other way around it. If there's anything we need to do is to improve the quality of economic and political governance in our countries and to be able to prevail in the global system. So the demons are internal, they are not outside. Thank you.
Yeah. I can't hear, okay.
I just finished. I guess it may be your line. Daniel, you
I
heard
think
me?
it is my line here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. I thank you. I thank you very much. For the interest of time, I think we received so many very important messages from our three presenters. Not in order of presentations of priority, but we have heard that we need a political will and an enabling environment for our countries to unlock the potential that they have and harness the comparative advantages that they have. We heard that we need to work in synergies. Countries have what others may not have, and working together on a common African agenda will certainly help to have all these issues addressed. From one presenter, we heard that we need to shift also our mindset and habits, dietary habits, to some of the products which can be produced locally, like cassava, like potato, like sorghum, to augment the wheat, which is highly imported from countries where currently we have some crisis. From all of them, it was a call for action, which we need, and that call need to be sustained, not only during the war time, the time we have the crisis between Russia and Ukraine, but to be continued as part of the lesson learned from the challenges that we have gone through during the past 2.5 years. And here I'm talking about the pandemic and the slowdown it caused to our economies, including agriculture, and also the current crisis between Russia and Ukraine with its own impact. We heard from our presenters that we need to use different ways to increase our productivity. And this is including leveraging biotechnology. And here, the idea of our participant who said that we could also use microbes, I think those are part of the innovative ideas and methods and technologies that we could bring on board to improve productivity and enhance production, food production, so that we can have a sustainable food that we have on the continent. One of the presenters came also to the need to increase the participation of all the components of our population, including women and youth, and unlock the potential of their ingenuity. So I want to thank very much our panelists. Usman, thank you very much. I thank you very much, Kabir. I thank you very much, Daniel, for your insights, and your very thoughtful proposals during this discussion, as well as the responses you have given to the questions of our participants. On behalf of AATF, we want to express our profound gratitude to the panelists for their educative and enlightening presentations. We also would like to extend a hearty thank you to all of you participants for your active participation and your questions and comments. We also would like to thank you for being with us and invite you for the next interaction through webinar or other media. I want to thank those of our development partners who managed to participate from very far and wake up very early. Lawrence, thank you very much. For all of you and the team that prepared the webinar, thank you very much and God bless you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Canisius, for having us, and thank you, everybody. You guys have a great week. Ciao.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
We believe that the future of Africa lies in its vast land. We believe the future is in the hands of those who walk the fields. For those are the hands that feed nations and ensure a better and more productive Africa.